We will be in Matthew chapter 5 this morning as we continue looking at the Sermon on the Mount. You need to understand that everything Jesus is doing up to this point is revolutionary. Everything Jesus is doing is shocking, and to some it would have been even appalling. Typically, teaching was done in the temple, but Jesus is here on the side of a hill in Galilee. Typically, teaching was done to the religious establishment. But Jesus here is preaching to farmers and to fishermen, to tax collectors, to sinners, not just to the scribes and Pharisees. And typically, teaching was done just for men, but here Jesus is including women and children as well. And typically, teaching was a commentary on the law. But Jesus has yet to even mention the law. Jesus has yet to begin to talk about what the law says and His opinion of it. And everybody was probably perplexed, and everybody was probably aghast, wondering as Jesus has launched into this sermon about what it means to be under His rule, under His reign, what it means to be a follower of Him. And He's yet to even mention the Old Testament. Certainly He's alluded to it in the Beatitudes, but He's not commented on it. And Jesus, perhaps even sensing the questions in people's minds, begins to talk about this. So look with us here in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 17. So we see what Jesus says about the law. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." One of the big questions for Christians is, what do we do with the law? What do we do with the Old Testament? And Jesus has said such revolutionary things, and Jesus has said such ground-shaking things that people are beginning to question this. What about the Old Testament, Jesus? What do we do with it? And Jesus says, I haven't come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill the law. Now, when Jesus speaks of the law, He is speaking of those first 5 books of the Old Testament, commonly called the Pentateuch, the Law of Moses. Those first 5 books of the Bible contain God's plan for His people. This was His charter for the nation of Israel. And in the Pentateuch, there are 248 laws, that is, positive commands. Do this, live this way, act this way. And there are 365 negative commands, 365 warnings. Don't do this, thou shalt not, all that. And these laws became the foundation of the religion of Israel. And Jesus here is speaking, and Jesus begins to teach, and He's not even mentioned these. The Jews thought their very salvation, they thought that their eternal souls rested on the obedience and the adherence to these commands. And Jesus, as He's talking, has not even alluded to them. And Jesus says, I want you to know, I haven't come to get rid of the law. I've come to fulfill the law. Now, what does it mean to fulfill the Old Testament? It's interesting to note Jesus says the law or the prophets. Jesus has probably been charged with getting rid of the law. And He says, listen, I'm not come to abolish the law or the prophets, the whole Old Testament. I've come to fulfill it. 7 years or so ago, Sarah and I got married. And on our wedding day, Sarah did not say to me, now, Michael, I want you to know I've abolished dating in your life. You think, well, she should have, But she didn't. She fulfilled dating in my life because you know what? We still date. At least up until 2 years ago we did. But we still date. There's still courtship. But the whole point of dating was to find somebody to fill my life, somebody to spend the rest of my life with, somebody to pour my life into. And when Sarah and I got married, she didn't say, that's it, dating's done, we don't need it anymore. She's saying, I fulfilled it. I am the intent. I am the one that dating was all about. And this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I haven't come to get rid of the law and the prophets. It's not that they don't mean anything anymore. I've come to fulfill them. And so how does Jesus do that? Well, one, he fulfills the law in his doctrine. He brings out the real significance of God's commands. Beginning next week, we're going to look at how Jesus does this. Jesus is going to take these commands that are in the Old Testament, and Jesus is going to show the Israelites, Jesus is going to show the religious establishment how they've missed it. Because Jesus is showing them they're just looking at his commandments on a surface level, when God always intended so much more. Jesus does this in his life as he says, what is the very essence of the law? It's two things. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says this is the very essence of the law. This is at the heart of everything God says. And so Jesus partially fulfills the law through his doctrine by teaching what it is that God intended all along and that humans had missed. But he fulfills the prophets in his deeds. As Jesus is the prophesied Messiah that God sent to save us. Throughout the prophets spoke of this Messiah who would come, this Messiah who would deliver God's people, who would deliver people from sin, who would deliver people from enslavement. And Jesus is the one that the prophets spoke of. He's the one who was born of a virgin. He was the one who was born in Bethlehem. He was the one who fulfilled all those royal psalms. He's the one that all of the prophets were pointing to, but he also, through his deeds, lives out everything the prophets say. I mean, you see in the prophets both this foretelling, this predicting of the future, but this forthtelling, this speaking to their current situations. And the prophets are all about what it means to be a people who are holy, a people who are set apart for God. And Jesus shows through his life. Jesus doesn't just fulfill the prophets by being the one who was prophesied of, but everything Jesus does shows what it means to live a life that is holy, that is set apart for God, that is set apart for his purposes, and that seeks to honor him in all things. But Jesus also fulfills the law in his death. Jesus shows us the law's holiness as he bears the penalty of breaking the law by taking our place before the judgment seat of God. See, Jesus isn't saying the law doesn't matter. Because if the law didn't matter, Jesus wouldn't have to die. Jesus is saying precisely because the law does matter, precisely because the law reveals the very character of God, precisely because the law shows us what it means to be holy, precisely because the law shows us what it means to follow God. Jesus is saying, because that has not been done, I'm coming, and in my death I am fulfilling the law and the prophets, because in my death I am taking on the punishment, I'm taking on the consequences of those who have not followed the law. Jesus says he is the one who is going to bear judgment for not following the law, instead of the judgment falling on all the lawbreakers. What Jesus is saying here is Jesus is saying, I am the center of attention. The signs, that is the Old Testament, that point to Jesus fade into the background now that he's there. You ever go and you go to a restaurant and it's a town you're not familiar with, it's a place you've never been, and you're driving around, you're looking for a place, and you see the decorations outside, and you see the sign, and it looks really great, and it looks like it's going to be a wonderful place to eat, and you go in, and you eat, and the best thing you can say about the restaurant is how nice the sign is. That's an awful feeling. You feel like you just wasted a meal. One of the things I like to do, I like to go And I like to find those hole-in-the-wall dives. The place where, you know, you kind of have to look the other way about what the health department says about them. Because you just tell yourself, well, the kitchen's clean. I don't see the kitchen, but the kitchen's fine. There's a place in Lexington called Loudon Square Buffet. I love Loudon Square. Best catfish and cornbread in Lexington. But it is nasty. There is like a coat of gunk on the table. You kind of need to bring some of those Clorox wipes with you. We don't need to get a child seat for Henry. We can just set him in there and he can't move because the seats are so sticky. And there's those creepy porcelain dolls that line the wall, and it's like they're just watching you eat. And you just kind of want to turn their face away because it gives you this weird, eerie feeling. I love that place. Because whatever it looks like, the food is worth all that other stuff. And Jesus here is saying, guys, you all are focusing on the signs. You're focusing on these superficial things, but you're missing what they're pointing to. You're missing me. You're so busy looking at the signs. You're so busy focused on these laws that you're missing the fulfillment of these laws. Jesus even puts a time frame. He says that all of the law is going to stay. He says not an iota, the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, the iota, it's just a little pen stroke. Not even the kind of the thing that would dot an I or cross the T, the very smallest punctuation mark. Jesus say none of that stuff is going to pass away until it is all accomplished. Jesus here is saying that He is the key. He is the key to understanding the law. By understanding who Jesus is and by understanding what Jesus does, Jesus is saying, I'm not getting rid of the Old Testament. I'm fulfilling the Old Testament. And because of my coming, because of who I am, because of what I've come to do, everything changes. Just think for a moment about how this works. Typically in the Old Testament, you have 3 divisions of the law. That doesn't always work, and it's not super neat and tidy, but it's been pretty helpful, and I think it works the best. First, you have the ceremonial law. Right, these are all those laws in the Old Testament about sacrifice and what you can wear in the temple and all that sort of stuff. And we as Christians, we read that and we wonder, what am I supposed to do with all these laws about sacrifice? What am I supposed to do with all these laws about how many doves I'm supposed to bring to the temple? What am I supposed to do with all these laws about what's appropriate to wear in the temple? What do I do with those? You see, if we understand Jesus is the key and all that is filtered through Him, we understand that Jesus fulfills this because Jesus is the ultimate and final sacrifice. You know, no other sacrifice has to ever be offered. No other sacrifice will ever be pleasing to God because of what Jesus has done. Jesus was the final, Jesus was the ultimate, Jesus was the perfect sacrifice. And because His blood was shed on the altar, and because His wounds pour forth constantly prayers they plead for us because they are pleasing to God, no other sacrifice ever needs to be offered ever again. Now, that's not to say we get rid of those, but it means we think about them differently. We see in these laws what it means to be holy. We see in these laws what it means to worship God. We see in these laws that God determines how we approach Him. But we don't have to follow these laws to the letter of the law because Jesus has fulfilled them. Then in the Old Testament, you have what are called sometimes civil laws. These laws govern the nation of Israel. Israel was set up to be a nation where God was their king, and the way they demonstrated that God was their king was by following all these things. They were to have these cities of refuge. They were to have roofs built around, or fences built around the roofs of their house. There are all these laws that apply to the people of Israel. And we read these in the Old Testament. We read these in Leviticus and in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and we just go, what's that got to do with me? But if we see Jesus is the key, Jesus is the prism through which we view these, through His person and through His work, what we're seeing is that Jesus He's expanding the kingdom. No longer is the kingdom just these people. No longer is the kingdom a nation, but the kingdom is all who put their faith in Him. The kingdom is all who are under His lordship. And we apply these differently because we're seeing what it means to demonstrate God's lordship in our life. We see what it means to show our lives as set apart for Him. But then there's a third category, the moral law of God. The moral law, perhaps these are best summed up maybe in the Ten Commandments. And because Jesus has come, Jesus lived these out. Jesus obeyed all these. And what we see is as followers of God, because this moral law reveals His character, we still have to follow it. People go into the book of Leviticus and they say, well, you're not supposed to follow all of it because you follow this aspect, but you still eat shellfish, you still eat, you wear clothes of mixed fabric. How can you pick and choose? Well, we're not picking and choosing. We're doing what Jesus told us to do. And we're seeing how Christ has fulfilled the law, and we're following the law as Christ has fulfilled it. And so Jesus says, I haven't come to do away with the law, I've come to fulfill the law. What Jesus is doing here is He's not getting rid of the law, He's raising the stakes. Jesus is showing us that there is far more than just obeying the letter of the law. Jesus is saying we are still bound by the law. We still answer to the law. But the law has changed. Because what in essence we're looking at is not how Jesus views the law, but how the law views Jesus. We're looking at how the law stands in respect to Him. And Jesus says that we are still accountable to this. Some people will say stuff like, well, I'm not under the law, I'm under grace. And they use that as an excuse to say, well, I can do whatever I want to do, and I can live however I want to live because I'm not bound by the law anymore. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying the exact opposite. Jesus is saying we are still under the law, but the way we obey it is different. Jesus goes on to say that we have this responsibility. Look at what He says here. He says, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Listen to this. Therefore, because the law does not pass away, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. You hear Jesus saying, if you relax, if you say, I'm done with the law, that's not acceptable. So what is our stance towards the law? Well, we need to understand first, we cannot ignore the law. As a Christian, I can't ignore the law. I've tried before in churches to get us to read through the Old Testament, and invariably what happens, Genesis is fine, Exodus is fine, you hit Numbers, oh. Leviticus though, man, that's just the worst. You just read all those laws and you think, I'm done. I can't take any more of this. Because so much of it seems so strange, and we want to just move past it. Let's just get to the Sermon on the Mount. Let's just skip over to Matthew. Jesus is saying we do not have the option of just ignoring the law. The way we obey it may be different. The way we understand it and apply it may be different. But the one thing we cannot do is ignore it. Because the law reveals something about who God is, and the law reveals something about how we're to follow Him. And so to ignore it is to ignore what God is revealing about Himself. Jesus is saying we cannot ignore the law. But the other thing we can't do is we can't prioritize the law. Jesus says that the laws, whether you think they're great, whether you think they're the least, it doesn't matter. What sometimes we like to do is we like to think, well, I don't commit those big sins. I don't do the really bad things. I just, is it really that bad, Michael? If I cheat on my taxes, that's just once a year. Not that bad. Look at how the government spends my money anyway. And we think, oh, it's just a small thing. You hear what Jesus is saying, though? There is no prioritizing the law. Whether it's the biggest command or the littlest command, you're a lawbreaker. You don't get to just pick and choose. So what sometimes people like to do is say, well, I obey these. I obey 90%. I obey 85% of the law. And the 15% I disobey, that's just really irrelevant stuff anyway. It's not that important. We can't prioritize the law. Think about it. Think about how we stand with the Ten Commandments. Let's just cut to the chase. We won't go through all the 10 of them. Let's just talk about the one that's the easiest to obey. The Sabbath. I mean, that one's the easiest one because all you got to do is that one is nothing, right? To obey the Sabbath is just to rest. We're not going to get into the tough ones like coveting. Nobody needs to meddle in our business about whether or not we covet. We don't want to talk about whether or not we keep God first. Let's just talk about the easiest one of the 10 Commandments to obey. Whether or not we keep the Sabbath. Do we set apart a day for rest and to make it holy? You say, well, Michael, I'm at church. Of course. I've set apart a day for rest and worship. Yeah, but what does God say? He says, remember the Sabbath day and what? Keep it holy. Now, that's where it gets tricky. Because keeping the Sabbath holy doesn't just mean you get to take a nap. Keeping the Sabbath holy doesn't just mean you have religious basis to demand a day off work. Keeping the Sabbath holy means you are taking a day where your focus is on nothing and on no one but God. How do we do? Ugh. You say, I do fine now. Well, what about when football season kicks in? It gets tougher then. We don't take this day that God has set. God roots it in creation. And what did God do on the Sabbath? He did nothing. He rested from His works. And we rest to worship Him. We rest to focus on Him. And God gives us His commandment where all we have to do is focus on Him. All we have to do is put all of our attention on Him. All we have to do is make the day about Him. And we don't do that. Because even when we're at church, even when we're worshiping, we're still thinking about ourselves. We're still thinking about what we need to do. We're still thinking about what we've got to do this afternoon when we get home. We're thinking about all sorts of things. And instead of focusing on God, instead of hearing from Him through His Word, our ears and our minds are closed because all it's consumed with is ourselves. And we say, but I do the other 9. But Jesus' whole point is you don't have the luxury of just picking and choosing and itemizing and saying, here are the ones I'm not tempted by. Here are the ones I'm not guilty of. So these are the ones I'm going to focus on. All of the law, keeping all of it is essential. So what is our stance towards the law? We need to understand we are accountable to the law. I am accountable to the law of God. You know, what we like to do in churches, what we like to do in our culture, is we like to keep changing the definition of stuff. And we like to downgrade sins to just mistakes. I'm not a sinner, Michael. I just made some mistakes. I can do better. I could do this differently, but it's not really a sin. It's not that bad. It's just a mistake. It was an error in judgment. And we lessen ourselves from sinners to just thinking that we are what maybe you could call a mistaker because we've downgraded God's laws to simply God's suggestions. God has said this. Well, but God, times are different now, God. I know when you said that 4,000 years ago, I know what the culture was like, I know how things were, but things are just so radically different. God, this isn't going to float in this day and age. So I understand it's a suggestion, I heard you, but I'm going to do something different. We don't have that option. Because if He is God, and if these laws are His commands, not His suggestions, to violate them is to sin. It's not simply to make a mistake. It is to sin against a holy God. But we want to think that all we've done is make mistakes, because if all we've done is made a mistake, then all we have to do is try harder. If all we've done is mess up, if all we've done is have bad judgment, if all we've done is veer up in the path just a little bit, then all we need to do is change course. All we need to do is work harder. All we need to do is make a little bit more effort. All we need to do is put more into it. But if we are sinners who have violated God's law, then our only hope is a Savior. If God is telling us through Jesus Christ that His law will always stand until heaven and earth passes away, until creation is no more, until Christ returns, if Christ is telling us that His law stands, then to violate His law is to sin against a holy God and to stand under the condemnation of His wrath and His judgment. And what I don't need is to try harder. What I need is somebody to save me. I don't just need to put more effort into it. I need to be rescued. And what Jesus is saying is that your soul is hanging on whether or not you keep the law. And this is where we say, uh-oh. This is where we realize we're in trouble. Because whether big or small, we violated God's law. And Jesus does not necessarily offer us hope here, because what does Jesus say? He says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is where it gets tough, because the scribes and the Pharisees, literally that word Pharisee means separatist. The scribes were these scholars of the law. These guys, all they did all day long was sit around and argue about how to keep the law. I mean, think about it. If your eternal destiny rides on whether or not you keep God's law, you're going to think pretty hard about whether or not you're keeping it, aren't you? I mean, you can go through and they have all these books, the Talmud, the Midrash, all these things where these scholars debate. They talk about all kinds of things. This isn't a joke. One of the questions is, can you eat an egg that was laid on the Sabbath? Now, you think, that's a silly question. Somebody's got too much time on their hands. But if that omelet's going to send you to hell, that's an important question, isn't it? You know what their conclusion was? If the hen was a laying hen, if its sole purpose was to lay eggs, then if it laid an egg on the Sabbath, that was work. And so all those eggs had to be discarded. But if it was a frying hen, if it was just there to eat later, why, it wasn't working. It just happened. And so you could eat the eggs laid by frying hens. Now, you think, that's ridiculous. It is. This is the folly of religion. This is the folly of this performance-based belief that I can earn God's love, I can earn salvation, I can earn righteousness. Because Jesus is saying that His standard is perfection. The only hope we have is perfect, total, complete righteousness. And the only way that we can be righteous is if we have this righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, Jesus' audience would have probably been panicking here, because this was their job. All they did all day was decide what righteousness was and how to do it. How in the world could they have righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and Pharisees? But again, we've got to understand what Jesus is talking about, because Jesus is not saying that if the scribes and Pharisees score a 90 on the righteousness scale, the only way to get into heaven is if you've got a 91 or higher. Jesus is speaking rhetorically, and He's saying the only way you get into heaven is if you have this exceeding righteousness, this perfect righteousness. How do we have that? I think we need to understand two things. First, we need imputed righteousness. I must be credited with the righteousness of Jesus. My only hope, because I have violated the law, because I have sinned against God, because whether I have broken big laws or little laws, one law, many laws, because I am a lawbreaker, because I am a sinner, my only hope to be righteous, to be perfectly righteous, is to be credited with the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So here's the thing. If God's standard is perfection, sin can't enter into the picture at all, can it? It's not that you can have sin and you can just pile good works on top of it and think that the sin is somehow hidden and buried beneath all this effort and all these good works. Because it's not. It can't work that way. If God's standard is to have this exceeding righteousness, the only hope I have is for Jesus Christ, who died in my place, who bore in Himself the wrath of God, who lived a perfect, sinless life. The only hope I have is if He credits that righteousness to me. And through the promise, if we put our faith in Jesus, that's exactly what He does. When I stand before God, if my faith is in Jesus Christ, and God says, why should I let you into heaven? My answer is not because I'm a good person. My answer is because Jesus Christ is my Savior. My answer is because He was righteous. And God does not see me in all my sinfulness. God does not see me in all my wickedness. God does not see me in all my deception and self-centeredness. God sees me through the blood-stained righteousness of Jesus Christ. And I need Jesus' righteousness credited to me. I would challenge you this afternoon. We don't have time to go there. Read Galatians chapter 3. This is precisely what Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 3. That when we stand before God, we are not standing in our own righteousness. We are standing in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. That is our only hope. If your hope is to stand before God saying you've been a good person and you've gone to church and you've tried really hard and you've helped people out, that's not going to cut it. We need the perfect righteousness of Christ. But this exceeding righteousness not only needs to be an imputed righteousness, it needs to be an inner righteousness. See, Jesus defines for us later on in the book of Matthew the righteousness of the Pharisees. In Matthew chapter 23, beginning in verse 25, He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and plate, that the outside may also be clean." Whoa! So much for meek and mild Jesus there. Goodness! You hear what Jesus is saying? He's saying all you're doing is polishing the outside, but inside you are filthy and corrupt. Your only hope is if the inside is clean. And so what Jesus is calling for when He's talking about this righteousness greater than that of the scribes and the Pharisees is an inner righteousness. See, so often what we try and do is we try and make the outside look good. We think that if I do things, if people see me working hard at church, if I teach a Sunday school class, if I'm a deacon, if I'm a preacher, if I help people out, if I'm kind to people, if people see me and think I'm a good person, then that's what's important. And we work on all this stuff so that people see the outside. But Jesus is saying, it doesn't matter. Jesus is saying what's important is the inside. Jesus is saying what is important is our motives and our desires. When we are saved, Jesus credits us with His righteousness, but Jesus also gives us a new heart and makes us righteous. He changes our desires, and so no longer is it about what I think people see me doing and what I want to be seen doing. No longer is it about just the things I do. It's about who I am. See, if all I am is a mistaker, if all I am is somebody who makes mistakes and does not follow God's suggestions, then my hope is to do more and to try more and to be seen more. But if I am saved by the grace of God, I do things not because I have to, but because I want to. I don't do them to earn salvation. I do them because I have already received salvation. William Cowper, who wrote There Is a Fountain Filled with Blood, he was one of the great poets, and he wrote this. He said, to see the law by Christ fulfilled and hear His pardoning voice changes a slave into a child and duty into choice. I love that. You hear what he's saying? He's saying when we truly are saved, when Christ gives us this new heart, when Christ makes us righteous, when He gives us a heart, righteousness comes from the inside of us. It's not because we have to do it. It's because we want to do it. It's because we've been so radically changed that our desires and our motives, everything about us is different. We're not concerned with trying to earn heaven. We know God has already earned that through Jesus Christ and graciously given that to us through our faith. It is saying that because I have received this wonderful, unfathomable gift, all I want to do is live my life to serve Him and honor Him. Jesus says the only hope we have is if we have this exceeding righteousness, this righteousness imputed to us by Christ, and this inner righteousness that grows from what Christ has done in our hearts. We've got to think, what does that look like? What does it look like in the life of a Christian to see this exceeding righteousness? What are some ways I can gauge myself? A couple things I want us to see. First, we need to understand that essentially what Jesus is doing here as we're entering the body of the sermon is Jesus is contrasting two ways of living. Jesus is contrasting maybe what you can call religious righteousness. That is this idea that through my performance, God is pleased with me. That if I try hard enough, I'm good. The second way that Jesus is the second lifestyle Jesus is portraying is what you might call gospel genuineness. That is, what does it look like when Christ has truly taken hold of us and exercises His lordship in our life? It's not just performance. It's not just stuff we do like the Pharisees. It's not just these actions and these motions we go through. But it's who we are because God has so transformed us. And Jesus is contrasting those. And the first sign I want us to see that we have exceeding righteousness is that we are more concerned with motives than with actions. See, religious righteousness just wants to act a certain way. The reality is I don't know what's in any of your minds right now as I'm preaching. I don't know what was in any of your minds while you sat in Sunday school class. I don't know what was in anybody's mind this week while they were helping with VBS. But you want to know something? God knows. And He knows the difference between somebody who says, I'm here because I want to be seen, and somebody who says, I'm here because I want to serve. You know, the reality is on the outside, both those people can look exactly the same. But if we have this righteousness that's not just in our actions, but comes from inside, that comes from our motives, that comes from our desires, you see, Jesus is looking deeper than just what we do. Jesus is looking at what we think and how we feel. Is our service something we want to do? Is our service something we feel we have to do? Gospel genuineness, instead of wanting to act a certain way, seeks to be like Christ in every way. The SS Sultana was the largest maritime disaster in the history of the United States, where 1,800 people died on the SS Sultana. About 300 more than died on the Titanic. The SS Sultana is really not thought of very much. It's kind of forgotten as a footnote in history because the day after the Sultana exploded, the day before it exploded, John Wilkes Booth was caught and killed. And so it was overshadowed in the news. But the Sultana, it was a steamship, and it was making its regular route from New Orleans up to St. Louis. And it was bringing this time many former prisoners of war. The Civil War had just ended, and it was taking many guys from places like Andersonville, Union soldiers. It was taking them up north so that they could go back home. And somewhere just outside of Memphis, around Marion, Arkansas, there on the Mississippi, the Sultana exploded. And 1,800 of the almost 2,500 passengers died. For years, people have wondered what happened on the Sultana. What was the cause? Some Confederate soldiers claim that they had put what's called a coal torpedo. They would make these hollow rocks that look like coal, and they would fill them with gunpowder, and as they were put in the steam engines, they would explode and take the ship with it. Some had claimed that. The common theory was that one of the boilers malfunctioned and exploded because on the voyage they had to stop and have the boilers repaired, and it wasn't repaired very well. And while it's probably true that the boiler was the cause of it, there was a deeper cause, there was a greater cause. There's a quartermaster there in New Orleans who was very crooked. And you see, the Sultana only had a legal capacity of 375. But this quartermaster had figured out a way that he would get $10 per head for everyone on the boat. And so he filled it full with almost 2,500 people. Now think about that. The capacity limit's 375. There are 2,500 on board. But as historians have dug into this quartermaster, what they have found is that he had several court-martials against him. He had been implicated several times before. But his brother was a very influential politician in Illinois. And his brother wrote to Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, both the current president and a future president. And they bribed Lincoln and Grant in order to get this man's charges dropped. And not only did he get the charges dropped against him, but he got a promotion where he was placed as the quartermaster there at the Port of New Orleans. And what was the cause of 1,800 deaths on the Sultana? It wasn't just overcrowding. It wasn't just a bad boiler. It was greed. And so often in our lives, we see sin. And what we need to understand is that sin is the symptom of the problem, not the problem itself. Because the problem is much deeper than sin. If all we do is stop our sins, but we're not changing our hearts, we've not fixed the problem. We've just addressed a symptom of the problem. See, what Jesus is getting at here is that the problem is deeper. We're gonna unpack this over the next several weeks, but Jesus will continue, and Jesus will say the problem's not murder. The problem's people who refuse to seek reconciliation. The problem's not adultery. The problem's people who don't pursue purity. The problem's not divorce. The problem's people who refuse to stay married. The problem's not lying. The problem's people who don't seek to be honest. The problem's not those who are seeking to get justice. The problem's people who refuse to surrender their rights. The problem is not those who just want to deal with their enemies. The problem is that people don't love others. Jesus is going past all these actions. Jesus is going past all the surface stuff, and He's diving deep to the very heart of us, the very heart of the problem of our hearts. And He's showing that it is our desires and our self-centeredness that is the cause of so many of the things that we do. And if we truly want to be those of an exceeding righteousness, we look past just our actions and we explore our motives and our desires to see if those are what honor Christ. Well, the first thing we need to see is that we need to be those who are more concerned with motives than actions. But secondly, we need to be a humble and grateful people. See, religious righteousness creates a pride-based performance. If I think my standing with God is based on what I do and how I act, what do you think is going to happen to me? I'm going to be arrogant. If I think that God loves me because He deems me worthy because of the things I do, I'm going to be conceited. I'm going to be filled with pride. That was the problem of the Pharisees. Do you remember Jesus tells the parable in Luke? And the Pharisee goes into the temple to pray. And do you remember the Pharisee's prayer? Thank God I'm not like these people. What a wonderful prayer to pray. Thank God I'm not as bad as all these guys around me. And because he thinks his relationship with God hinges on his performance, he has arrogance. The reality is that if we think God's pleasure is based on our performance, what's going to happen is we're going to start to compare ourselves against others. But let's be honest with what we do. We don't look for the best guy in town. We don't look for the person who wins humanitarian award after humanitarian award, do we? We say, well, I'm not Hitler. Well, good, congratulations. I mean, we measure ourselves against the worst of the worst. Well, I'm not as bad as them. At least I've never done this. But Jesus is not saying, well, so long as you're better than Michael, I'll let you into heaven. Jesus' standard is perfection. And if we are basing our idea of our relationship with God on what we do, we are going to compare ourselves against people. But here's what happens, is when we compare ourselves against people, we're going to look down on people. One of the problems, I think, with the ways Christians relate to so many is we look down on them because we measure ourselves against them. We say, well, at least I've never done this. And we pick a sin, homosexuality, spousal abuse, alcoholism, whatever it is, something we've not done. And we say, at least I've never done that. And we just discount a whole swath of people because we say, this is what makes you worthless. But when we have a gospel genuineness in us, we have this awe that's rooted in our understanding of grace. Because if we believe that our relationship with God is based on what we do, it creates arrogance. But when we understand our relationship with God is based on what Jesus has done, all it produces is humility. Because we understand grace. Listen to me and listen well. It did not require any less of God's grace to save you and forgive you than it did anybody else. It took just as much of God's grace to save me as it has the worst sinner who has ever lived. It took just as much of God's grace to forgive me of my sins as it has taken any murderer, any pedophile, any spousal abuser, any robber, anyone. Because sin is sin, and sin is an affront to God, and sin is a declaration of war against God. And God had to use just as much grace to forgive Michael as a 5-year-old child as He's had to use to forgive anybody in the history of the world. And when we understand my standing before God is based totally on what Jesus Christ has done, all I can do is be in awe and humbled by His grace. All I can do is fall on my face and say, thank you, God, that you have saved me. Thank you that you have rescued me. Thank you that you saw me in my sin and did not leave me there. And the way we relate to people is not in arrogance and not in pride, not thinking we are better, but realizing that we are sinners who have been saved by grace, and we want that same grace extended to them. We want that same forgiveness shown to them. And we, as those who have received God's grace, need to be those who want others to know it. We need to be those who extend that offer of grace to everyone. But the third thing I want you to see is the third sign of an exceeding righteousness is we seek to glorify God, not ourselves. Religious righteousness seeks to glorify itself. This is what the Pharisees did. Jesus talks about this. Pharisees wanted to make their name great. They wanted people to look up to them. They wanted people to think highly of them. They wanted people to be a little bit afraid of them. They wanted to be respected. They wanted to be honored. They wanted to be thought of as untouchable. And if you have your idea of righteousness is a performance-based religious righteousness that is earned by what you do, then your whole motive in doing that is to make your name great. You want people to look up to you. You want to avoid hell. You want to do all this stuff, and you think that by living a certain way and by doing certain things and following certain rules and regulations, you can achieve that for yourself. But this exceeding righteousness that Jesus says is necessary seeks to make His name great. Because what I understand is my life is lived as a trophy of God's grace. And that everyone who sees me does not see Michael, but who sees Michael after God has been at work in him and sees God as He is at work through me. I understand that the purpose of my life as one who has been redeemed by Christ, one who lives under the lordship of Christ, my purpose in life is to point people towards one who is greater than me. In everything I do, I want people to see Him. I don't want to receive credit because the reality is I don't deserve any of it. I don't deserve credit for any good thing I do. God deserves all the credit for whatever good I do. And as we live with this gospel genuineness, as we live as those with this exceeding righteousness, what we are doing is we are saying, I want God to receive all the honor and all the glory for anything I do because it is because of Him and it is for Him. Everything I do in my life is about Him. It is about people seeing how great God is. Listen to me. I am an exceeding sinner who has received exceeding grace. And I want to live with exceeding righteousness so people can see the exceeding greatness of my God and my Savior, Jesus Christ. Let's bow our heads. If you're here this morning and your idea of righteousness is something that you do, I hope you see Jesus dispels any notion of that. Your righteousness, your standing with God is not based on what you do. You don't get to move to the front of the line by simply being a good person. Our standing with God is based only on what Christ has done. The only way we can have a right relationship with God is through perfect, total righteousness. And our only hope for that is by putting our faith in Jesus Christ. And maybe you're here this morning and you've never put your faith in Jesus Christ, and you understand that were you to stand before God today and all you had to count on was your righteousness, you would be in trouble. Here's the good news. Christ offers you His righteousness freely. You don't have to do anything to get it. You don't have to act any certain way. You just have to trust in Him. But maybe you're here this morning and you're one of these that Jesus talks about that would be least in the kingdom because you don't live with this exceeding righteousness. Yes, you know you're saved, but you still live this performance-based life. You still think that you earn more favor or more blessings by simply doing stuff. And you're making life about you and not about Him. And this morning you understand that what pleases God, what God demands, is a righteousness that comes not from obligation or not from a desire to get, from a heart that wants to serve, a heart that wants to honor Him and make His name great. Maybe you just want to ask God, where you're sitting here at the front, wherever it may be, you just want to ask God to do a work in you so that you live this life of exceeding righteousness so that He is praised, so that He receives all honor and glory and credit. I don't know how God leads, but I know that as He speaks, it's our responsibility to follow. Father, I thank You so much for sending Jesus to do what we could not do, to achieve what we could not achieve. And I thank You for this wonderful free gift You offer us. Father, I pray that if there's anyone here who has not put their faith in You, Father, I pray that right now they would understand their only hope is based on what Jesus Christ has done. And Father, they would put their faith in Him. Father, I pray for myself. I pray for my brothers and sisters in Christ, that we would live lives of exceeding righteousness. That as you work in us, it pours out of us. That we show goodness and kindness and love, that we reflect your character, that we obey your law, but we do it as an act of love and an act of worship for you. Lord, we thank you for all you do for us. Thank you for Jesus Christ. It's because of His sacrifice we can pray now. And Father, it's because of His sacrifice we thank you. And it's in His name we pray. Amen. Let's stand and let's sing.